The Milk Carton Kid, The Disappearance of Etan Patz, 1979. Etan Patz was an outgoing, cheerful, and self-sufficient little boy. The 6-year-old, whose name meant strength in Hebrew, was small for his age. He attended grade 1 at public school and was learning how to read, and he asked his parents to read him a story each night before bed. He lived in a loft in New York's Soho district with his parents, Stan and Julie, sister, Shira, 8, and brother, Ari, 2. On May 25, 1979, Etan put on a pair of blue pants, a t-shirt, light blue sneakers, a blue corduroy jacket, and an Eastern Airlines cap that said Future Flight Captain on it. He had been begging his parents to let him walk to the bus stop by himself. That day, Julie finally agreed. It was less than 2 blocks from their loft at 113 Prince Street to the school bus at West Broadway and Prince Streets. Just before 8 a.m., Etan picked up his blue cloth school bag with elephants printed on it and put it on his shoulder. He had $1 in his pocket. His mother unlocked the door and followed him down the stairs. She watched him for a few moments stride down Prince Street on that misty, gray spring morning until he reached Wooster, and then she went back upstairs. Mailman Dorsey Whitaker saw Etan stopped at the corner of Wooster, but continued along his route. When Etan had not returned home by 3:30 p.m., Julie began to worry. She phoned a neighbor to find out if he was over at their house, and that is when she learned for the first time that he had never arrived at school. The school had never contacted the Patzes to alert them to his absence. 20 minutes later, she called Stan while he was at a photo shoot and also informed the police. Officers arrived and began asking the couple if they had any relatives or friends who could possibly be involved in Etan's disappearance. This was standard procedure, but they knew no one who would want to harm their son. Stan Patz walked into his darkroom and began printing photos of Etan. Then he showed them to storekeepers and any other place where he thought Etan might have gone that morning. He even stopped people on the street, but no one had seen him. If you enjoy the movie so far, please subscribe it and like it. Led by Detective Bill Butler, the police launched a door-to-door search in Soho that evening. The next day, officers had bloodhounds sniff Etan's clothes, and then they patrolled the neighborhood trying to pick up the little boy's scent. But it was gone. Helicopters flew over Manhattan's rooftops, and boats traveled the rivers bordering the island. More than 300,000 flyers were distributed. Etan's picture and the story of his disappearance ran in the tabloids every day. A task force of 500 police officers looked for him. A small boy who had blue eyes and blonde hair and looked just like Etan was stopped by police 11 times, until his mother finally cut his hair. The door-to-door search ended on June 6, 1979, having turned up no leads. Butler, a 25-year veteran of the police department, like the Patzes, he wanted to believe that Etan had been abducted by someone who wanted a child of their own, but there was no evidence supporting that conclusion. At the time, there was no national clearinghouse for finding and identifying missing children. Although there was a national system for tracking stolen vehicles, no one really kept statistics on the number of missing people, including children. Etan's disappearance galvanized the people in his neighborhood. For weeks they brought meals for the Patzes, and many police officers came to help with the search on their days off. For more than a month, Etan's best friends and the boy's parents spent their spare time hanging posters and looking for Etan. Bob Rafter, an artist and electrician, stopped working for a month after the disappearance and spent his time raising money and printing flyers. "I wasn't close to the Patzes," he told a reporter, "but I've got a kid who's 10 years old. It could have been him. It's my neighborhood." They helped put up posters of Etan in subways and restaurants and on storefronts and street lamps. But there was no sign of him. In desperation, the police hypnotized Julie, Whitaker, and neighbor Sylvia Law, who was out on the street at the time that he disappeared, but it did not turn up any new information. For the Patzes, the vigil continued. They kept the same telephone number. "It's the number Etan knows," they told a reporter. They tape-recorded every telephone call they received so that they could give police the exact message to listen to for possible clues as to their son's whereabouts. They maintained a detailed log of each call. After 4 months, Stan returned to work. The case also created fear. After Etan's disappearance, one little girl would stop every day at the phone booth near the school bus stop and call home. "I'm at the corner. Mama, I'm okay," she would say. Children began traveling in pairs. Leads continued to trickle in. Butler received a phone call in 1980 from a police sergeant in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He said that a woman reported seeing a man at a motel with a little blonde boy who might be Etan. After investigating, police discovered that it was a man who had kidnapped his own son and had an arrest warrant in Wisconsin. The case also attracted con artists. On May 21, 1981, a Long Island man was charged with attempting to extort $2,500 from Etan Patz. He had implied that he could guarantee Etan's safety. 32-year-old James Slaughter was arrested near the West Hempstead Motor Hotel, where he had allegedly gone to collect payment from Patz. On December 3 of that year, police found the photo of a boy who closely resembled Etan at a cottage that they raided in Wareham, Massachusetts. A group called the North American Man-Boy Love Association used the house. 3 men were arrested. One of them said that he had seen a copy of the photo in an apartment in Manhattan. Consequently, the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided 3 apartments in Manhattan that belonged to members of a pornography group in an effort to find photos or any other clues about Etan. Nothing turned up. Julie and Stanley Patz looked at the photo, but they could not say with any certainty that the boy was their son. Then police learned that it was not, and that the photo had appeared in a calendar in 1968. Media coverage of the raid and a possible connection to Etan's disappearance led a New York cab driver to step forward with another lead in the case. Chester Jones said that the day Etan went missing, he had picked up the boy and a man near the Patz home in Soho. The man had blonde hair, was about 30 years old, and weighed about 135 pounds. Apparently, the pair climbed out of the cab after 7 blocks when the boy protested. He said that his parents had told him not to talk to strangers. And there the trail ended. In 1982, police caught what they initially thought could be a break in the case. They found a long-haired drifter named Jose Antonio Ramos living in a drainpipe in the Bronx. He was suspected of having tried to lure young boys there. Among his meager possessions were photos of young boys. Some were blonde and one resembled Etan. During questioning, Ramos denied that he knew Etan, but he eventually admitted that he had dated a single mother who lived near the Patzes and who had looked after Etan. Stan and Julie Patz looked at the pictures that police found with Ramos. They were relieved that none were of their son, but they were also devastated that they were no closer to finding the truth about what had happened to Etan. Investigators could not find a strong link between Ramos and Etan to hold the drifter, so Ramos was released. He was picked up again 5 months later for soliciting sex from 3 underage boys. After placing him under observation behind bars for several months, Ramos was released. The Bronx District Attorney said that he did not have enough evidence to charge Ramos in Etan's abduction. 3 years later, Stuart Grosbois took on the case in 1985 when he became an assistant U.S. attorney. By 1988, police had 4 filing cabinets stuffed with information that they had gathered on the case. They had investigated thousands of leads from around the world, but none shed any light on the fate of Etan Patz. Grosbois re-examined every piece of evidence, but he turned up no new clues. Then Grosbois decided that it was time to look more closely at Jose Ramos, who was now behind bars in Rockview State Prison in Pennsylvania. Ramos had been driving around in an old school bus handing out toys, and he had lured a victim at the annual hippie gathering of the Rainbow Family of Living Light onto his bus. In 1987, Ramos was sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years for indecent assault on a 5-year-old child. Ramos was brought to Grosbois' office on June 28, 1988. Under questioning, the convicted sex offender said that he had picked up a small boy with blonde hair in Washington Square Park on the day of Etan's disappearance. That was 5 blocks from the Patz family's loft. He then brought the boy back to his apartment for sex, but Ramos claimed that he never harmed the boy. He dropped him off at the subway heading to Washington Heights because the boy wanted to visit an aunt there. Etan Patz did not have an aunt living in the area. Grosbois believed that Ramos knew more about the case than he was saying. Unable to extract a confession from Ramos, Grosbois tried a different strategy. In an unusual move, he was deputized as a deputy state attorney general in Pennsylvania in 1990 to prosecute a child molestation case against Ramos. He hoped this would give him the leverage that he needed to extract a confession or more information about Etan's disappearance and murder. Ramos was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He would be eligible for parole in September 2000. Grosbois, however, had not been able to gain new information from Ramos about Etan Patz. In 1991, Grosbois and FBI Special Agent Mary Galligan arranged to have Ramos transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Otisville. They placed a white-collar criminal that they called John Morgan in his cell in a protective segregation unit. It was part of an undercover operation to try to cement evidence against Ramos. Morgan shared with Grosbois that Ramos was familiar with all the stops that Etan's school bus made in 1979. He knew that Etan's was the 3rd one in Soho. Ramos also talked about his former girlfriend who had looked after Etan. Ramos claimed that it would be impossible to charge him with murder since there was no body. After weeks without a confession, Morgan was removed from the cell. Informant Jeremy Fisher went in and got to work. Ramos described how he had picked up Etan on Prince Street and assaulted the boy, but he refused to finish his story. Nonetheless, Grabois was convinced that Ramos had killed Etan and burned the body. The Patzes were, too. Without a body, however, District Attorney Robert Morgenthau said that there was insufficient evidence to convene a grand jury and prosecute Ramos. Grabois left the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1993. One morning in June 2000, a dozen police officers and detectives pulled up to the six-story red brick building at 234 East 4th Street on the Lower East Side just before 8 a.m. They went down into the dark basement where Ramos had lived in 1979, a mile from the Patz family's loft. During their 8-hour search, police pulled apart a rusted, unused 1939 coal-fired furnace and removed it in chunks. It had not been used since a new furnace was installed in 1998. They also filled a dozen blue plastic barrels with ash and dirt from the basement floor. They used DNA technology to try to find evidence that linked Ramos to Etan, but all that they found were the remains of dead animals. Detectives returned to the basement in August 2000. They drilled holes in the floor, but sniffer dogs were unable to detect signs of human remains. Stan Patz wanted to prevent Ramos from benefiting from his crime. In June 2001, he had his son declared legally dead after a waiting period. Although Julie Patz was not prepared to sign the papers declaring her missing son dead, she did not oppose her husband's efforts to move forward. Etan Patz was declared legally dead 22 years after he mysteriously disappeared from a Soho street. The case remains open, but Etan Patz leaves behind an important legacy. His disappearance raised public awareness about missing children. He became the first victim whose photo appeared on the side of milk cartons. In 1985, he was the first missing child that the New York City Police Foundation chose to feature on an electronic screen that overlooked Duffy Square. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25 National Missing Children's Day. Americans were asked to keep their porch lights on to light the way home. That year, Julie and Stanley Patz, Camille Bell, and Rev and John Walsh, the parents of children who had disappeared or were murdered, spoke to Congress about the need for the federal government to establish and maintain a comprehensive national computer registry of missing children. At the time, the FBI's National Crime Information Center had only about 10% of missing children on their list, partly because local police departments were not required to report disappearances to the FBI. Republican Senator Paula Hawkins from Florida and Democratic Representative Paul Simon of Illinois introduced the Missing Children's Act to establish a computer registry of missing children. Parents could have their child listed if local law enforcement authorities did not do so. President Reagan signed the bill into law in October 1982. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was founded 2 years later. Another innovation that came to the fore following Etan's disappearance was a new type of software. Artist Nancy Burson and husband David Kramlich, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Center for Advanced Visual Studies, pioneered the development of aging software. The FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children used it to project what someone may look like as they age. Parents also began fingerprinting their children on cards, with the blessing of law enforcement officials. Programs were voluntary, and parents would keep the only records. On a Mother's Day weekend in New England, for example, 40 McDonald's restaurants promoted a thumbs-up fingerprinting event. Although Etan Patz has been declared legally dead, New York Police Department case number 836, listed as a stranger abduction, remains officially open. On May 24, 2012, New York Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly announced that a man was in custody who had implicated himself in Etan's disappearance. A law enforcement official identified the man as 51-year-old Pedro Hernandez of Maple Shade, New Jersey, and said that Hernandez had confessed to strangling the child. Hernandez stated in his written confession to police, "I'm sorry, I shook, sick, him." At the time of Etan's disappearance, Hernandez was an 18-year-old convenience store worker in a neighborhood bodega. Hernandez said that he later threw Etan's remains into the garbage. Hernandez was charged with second-degree murder. According to a New York Times report from May 25, 2012, the police at that time had no physical evidence to corroborate his confession. A New York grand jury indicted Hernandez on November 14, 2012 on charges of second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. The lawyer has also said that Hernandez has a low intelligence quotient, IQ, of around 70, at the border of intellectual disability. The case resulted in a mistrial in May 2015 because of a hung jury that was deadlocked 11-1 for conviction. A retrial began on October 19, 2016 in a New York City court, With jury deliberations in February 2017. On February 14, 2017, Hernandez was found guilty of kidnapping and felony murder. On April 18, 2017, Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 25 years.